Hello, and welcome to All Things Considered, a podcast where we discuss important issues with fascinating guests through the lens of critical thinking. I'm your host, Christopher DiCarlo, and today's guest is Mick West, a British science writer, skeptical investigator, and retired video game programmer. For those of you who have ever played video games, Mick was the co-founder of a video game development company, Neversoft Entertainment, and they developed Spider-Man, Tony Hawk, Guitar Hero, and whatnot. So this guy is instrumental in programming some of the most popular games your kids have ever played. He is also the creator of websites, Debunk and Contrail Science, and he investigates and debunks pseudoscientific claims and paranormal conspiracy theories. And his first book is called Escaping the Rabbit Hole: How to Debunk Conspiracy Theories Using Facts, Logic, and Respect. Now, full disclosure here, folks. I too have just finished writing a book about how to talk to a conspiracy theorist. And Mick and I share our insights through our research over the years. And it's absolutely fascinating. We not only talk about specific conspiracy theories, but how to have that very difficult conversation with somebody who might be in your family, might be a friend or a relative, a colleague, somebody at work. And if you know somebody who's a conspiracy theorist, or even if you yourself have these types of beliefs, you may find this episode extremely helpful. So now, without further ado, let's get thinking. Mick West, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Yes. Mick, the subtitle of your book, How to Debunk Conspiracy Theories Using Facts, Logic, and Respect. I contacted you before this podcast even had developed because we were working on a book ourselves, How to Talk to a Conspiracy Theorist. And I reached out to you, among others, in the field. And it's an effort to help them. And in many ways, our ideas and the ideas found in your book overlap. Now, because this podcast is devoted basically to demonstrating the practical use and benefits of critical thinking by considering the structure of beliefs that conspiracists have and how they might differ from those who are not so conspiratorially minded. So, here's how I've set things up in the book that I'm currently writing. The conspiracist and the non-conspiracist arrive at entirely different conclusions about specific events. For example, a conspiracist believes that jet condensation trails, either aerodynamic or exhaust, are more than just condensation, but actually chemicals which are being disseminated into the environment for very specific reasons. A 9/11 truther believes that there were controlled explosions for the devastation of the Twin Towers. A false flag conspiracist believes that a horrific event is intended to draw blame to a third party because of an ulterior motive. And a flat earther believes the Earth is not an oblate spheroid, but is, well, flat. In all these books that I write about critical thinking, I look at arguments as though they're houses. I use this as a metaphor, where the roof is the conclusion and the walls are the premises, and the foundations are the criteria those premises must satisfy. Each conspiracist arrives at novel and unconventional conclusions. The questions we can now ask is, why? What are their premises in support of their conclusions? And why did they arrive somewhere different from our perspectives? And how do we have sensible and productive discussions which will lead them out of the rabbit hole?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's perhaps a bit of a mistake to try to divide people into conspiracists and non-conspiracists, because all of us, to some degree, believe that there are conspiracies going on. We believe that there are people in positions of power who are doing things that are not in our best interests. Now, we can very easily, like, say, take one group of people, like people who believe in chemtrails or flat Earth, and then contrast that with someone like regular scientists and say
Sure.
These are conspiracists and these are not. But in reality, I think it's more like a spectrum. there's a spectrum of kind of extremeness of belief, extremeness of how conspiratorial your interpretation of the universe is. And understanding where people fall on that spectrum is a very important tool in your toolbox of how to communicate with people. And I always try to get people to talk around a point that is not at the extremes. It's very easy to look at something that's very ridiculous and say, this is just silly. Why would you believe that thing? When in reality, the person you're talking to might not hold all of the conspiratorial beliefs that you ascribe to a particular thing. Like we say with 9/11 conspiracy theories, some people just have a somewhat more mundane interpretation of it as a conspiracy. Like they will think that, say, that the Bush government had some foreknowledge of what was going to happen, and they allowed it to happen. And the other, there's much more extreme versions of it where there are pre-planted explosives in the buildings, or they were hit by laser beams from space, or the nuclear bombs were planted underneath them. There are very silly things. So you've got to make sure when you're talking to people that you don't mischaracterize their position, because they might think that you're mocking them or you're creating a straw man argument.
Oh, of course. But would you still say that somebody who believes that it was like 19 jihadists hijacked a bunch of planes versus a very complex array of holographic images and whatnot, clearly they've come to two different conclusions, and the evidence or the premises they offer therein are quite distinct?
Yeah, well, along the line of the spectrum, there's going to be kind of points where you have to step up from one thing to another. You either believe something or you don't believe it. Like the issue of whether a plane hit the Pentagon is one of those points for 9/11 conspiracy theories. A lot of people who believe in 9/11 was an inside job will tell you that the Pentagon was not hit by a plane. But then there's also a bunch of people who believe 9/11 was an inside job who will tell you that it was, and they actually kind of fight with each other. And one side thinks the other side is either being fooled or is spreading disinformation. So yeah, there are definite points of distinction you can make, but a lot of the time it's kind of subtle, the spectrum and the points along the spectrum that the individual is on. So talking to people is really about, I think, establishing what they actually understand. And you don't want to jump in there thinking, oh, here I am talking to a 9/11 conspiracy theorist. I will start with my explanation of why a plane hit the Pentagon, or whatever the particular conspiracy theory is. You've really got to start by listening to them and not by talking at them.
Mm-hmm. I'm noticing that seems to be the model that people in the field are talking about now. Is a conspiracy theorist or a conspiracist can be your friend, can be your relative, anyone. Now, you've used the very generic term "your friend" to really cover that broad array of people in your life that might be affected by conspiracy theories. Could be a spouse, a child, a parent, or whatnot. What do you say to someone who thinks conspiratorial thinking is just quirky? Where's the harm? Where's the harm? Where do they lie on the spectrum? Is that you and me? And
if you want to know where the harm is, you sort of look at things like January the 6th, where people were essentially storming the US Capitol based on a conspiracy theory. It was very much a conspiracy theory that the election was stolen. There are people who are dead now who wouldn't be dead had they taken the vaccine, and they refused to take the vaccine in large part because of conspiracy theories. There's more extreme, like individual examples where, for example, the Heaven's Gate UFO cult. They believed that the government was covering up the truth about UFOs. So there's a conspiracy component there, and they thought that these UFOs were going to come and take them away to a better world, and so they all killed themselves. And there's something like 30 plus people committed suicide based on a false belief that included conspiracy theories. So there's very much harm, and even in things that seem like they're harmless. For example, UFOs, which I've been doing a lot of research into UFOs recently. People who believe that we have been visited by aliens necessarily have to hold the belief that the government is covering up information about alien visitors. So if you start getting deep into this seemingly harmless, like fun topic of, possible alien visitors, you get sucked into a deep distrust of government and a deep distrust of our academic institutions. And that can make it very easy for you to get sucked into other things as well. So I don't think there are really any harmless conspiracy theories. There are ones that don't seem like they are harmful, but they really, I hesitate to use the word slippery slope, but they can be primers for belief in other conspiracy theories which are more harmful.
Right, right. Now, in my books, I talk about the concept of theory. I'm trained in the analytic tradition of philosophy. And theory in science means one thing. It's a very highly held position of established facts. But in common language, it can often mean a hunch. So a conspiracy theory was, for whatever conditions in its etymological evolution, has become something that is both seen as derogatory towards people who hold those views because they don't look at themselves as being cranks or holding these silly views, while at the same time scientists look at it and say you shouldn't call it theory. Have you thought about, because we've given this some thought, should we try to clean up the language? Should we say, oh, you believe in a conspiracy story, it becomes a conspiracy theory when it's been proven, and a conspiracy myth when it's been falsified? Do we need to clean up the language, or are we stuck with the verbiage?
I think you can certainly attempt to clean up the language, but historically speaking, such attempts fail because language is an emergent property of civilization. It's not really something that is prescribed. It is something that's the Oxford English Dictionary, the most famous dictionary, well, in the UK at least, is a dictionary of common English usage. It's how people actually use the words, and it doesn't tell you how to use them. It tells them how people commonly use them. And the word conspiracy theory, the phrase conspiracy theory, has acquired this negative connotation because it refers to things that are frankly ridiculous. And there's a lot of things that are covered by it that are ridiculous. And if you were to change it to a conspiracy story, some people in the conspiracy community will say, "Oh, we should call it a truth theory instead,
right,
because it's a theory about what might be true." It's not going to help. You're going to muddy the waters by having like additional terms that no one's going to start using, and it will gradually acquire the same meaning if it refers to the same thing. I remember Richard Dawkins once tried to rebrand atheists as bright, which was a terrible idea.
No, that was Dennett, I think.
Oh, was it?
I think it was Dan.
I think
Dennett.
Dawkins was a fan of
he
the
jumped
idea.
on board.
Yes, but it was not it obviously didn't work because for a number of reasons. It didn't
go down well.
he seemed elitist, but also you can't force a new word upon people.
True.
So I don't think, and the distinction between theory and hypothesis, that's really only an issue for scientists, and they get all huffy about it. Oh, that's not a theory; it's a hypothesis. But the common English usage of the word theory is hypothesis, and just because the scientists use it to mean something that's more solid, you can't force the proper scientific usage on a population that is already using the word theory for something else.
Gee, an Englishman telling we can't change English. Oh, jeez. I don't know what to think now. I've mentioned various times that all humans are hypocrites and we just vary by degree and admission. Would you say the same holds true for conspiracy theorists? That to some degree we're all on the spectrum and we're just on the lower, end?
Yeah, I don't know really. I mean, it's being a hypocrite is saying one thing and doing another, and I think it's impossible for everybody to, on a practical basis, to live up to your proposed standards of morality. If I say I don't think lying is a good idea, and then my wife asks me if this dress she is wearing is good enough to go out in, then perhaps I might fudge the truth for a second. But there are some practical realities that we have that force things upon us. But with conspiracy theorists, it's like hypocrisy kind of comes in a kind of a functional way. Like it just is what happens based on your actions. So I think conspiracy theorists will say, "I'm just seeking the truth." I'm trying to figure out what's going on, but they then ignore a certain set of evidence because they have a cognitive bias towards a particular narrative. So they're not that their actions do not match their professed beliefs. So yeah, I mean, sure, I think all of us are hypocrites to some degree, and when it comes to a profession of critical thinking, perhaps conspiracy theories are a bit more hypocritical than average there.
Right. Staying on the idea of using spectrums and that sort of thing, you mentioned Walter Wilcox's development of one in 1962. It looks at the scale of one's commitment to a conspiracy theory as well as a non-rationality scale, and that there's a correlation. There's seems to be like an inverse proportion between the degree of non-rationality in a conspiracy theory and how committed the person is to that theory. So how much, if at all, is intelligence, general or otherwise, connected to conspiratorial thinking, would you say?
Well, intelligence is inversely correlated to belief in conspiracy theories, and you can certainly plot education levels against conspiracy theories, and you will generally get this negative correlation where the more education you have, the less likely you are to believe in conspiracy theories, or even in things like pseudoscientific things like to do with climate change and things like that. But it's a correlation, and it's not something that is necessarily true in every case. You can't make a one-to-one mapping between someone's belief in conspiracy and their actual intelligence. There's lots of super bright people who are believers in conspiracy theory. There's an organization called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which is comprised of people who are architects and engineers, and some of them are structural engineers. And they represent the small, tiny fraction of the population of professionals who believe in this particular conspiracy theory. So yeah, there's certainly this. It makes it easy to fall for a conspiracy theory if you don't have the mental tools and the mental framework and background and knowledge base to be able to see things in perspective and analyze things correctly. But it doesn't make you immune if you do have those things.
No, of course not. And is it content education? So I'm a huge advocate here in Canada, in Ontario. I've been lobbying the Ministry of Education here for a decade or so to try to get critical thinking at least into the high school system, if not into K-8. Do you think it's a specific type of education that people need to be able to empower themselves to know what is false or misleading, what is misinformation, what is disinformation? Do we need to get that into our school systems to younger people?
We do. I've a little bit of a problem with the phrase critical thinking, just simply because it's something that's very poorly defined, and it doesn't really have an accepted definition. But I think.
Well, read my books.
Do people accept your definition there?
Yeah, we've got it. We've got it down.
So
we don't.
But I think what people want, what we need in terms of education for this domain we're talking about, conspiracy theories and misinformation, is the ability to analyze claims. And if someone says something, how do you essentially judge that? How do you check it? And what kind of weight do you put on it? How do you look at a source and see, like, is this a type of person who would know what they're talking about? Do they have possible alternative motives, things like that? So there's certainly a variety of toolkits that we can equip people with, and that we should do. We also want to kind of inculcate a kind of natural immunity, a kind of antibody type thing in people's minds, so that when a new surprising idea comes along that seems attractive, they don't automatically just believe it because it seems like a good idea. Then they go in with a degree of skepticism, and they try to check it. So yeah, I think yes. I mean, if someone says, should there be more critical thinking taught in our schools, then I would say yes. definitely. But I think we need to kind of be practical about it.
Of course. Uh, I'll get our producers to send you one of my books, and you can take a look at it. Let me know what you think. It's very standardized. It uses mnemonics. It's very helpful. It's been introduced to as young as like grade 8 kids. They're able to understand it and follow it and whatnot. I've spent a lot of time trying to get the skill set honed down to some essential tools that people can use, and it's my hope to try to get that type of structure into, at least start with a high school system.
Yeah, that's great.
We had a pilot project for a year, and then a new government took over, and then so that was checked out, and so we're waiting to try to appeal to the current government to try to get that back up and going.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think it was in Arizona or Texas a few years ago. They actually put in the plank, the actual kind of manifesto of the conference, that they were opposed to teaching critical thinking in schools.
Yeah, that was Texas.
Yes, Texas. Okay, so yeah, so that's something that you also have a PR issue in that they think that you're using critical thinking. It's like now we have this issue with critical race theory, which is how does race and the history of race relations affect where we are as a society right now. But it's become this, you can't teach it in schools, and then you can't teach anything that's even vaguely related to it because people feel it's some kind of communist indoctrination. So that's something you have to be careful with the critical thinking thing. It's that it doesn't want to come across as being politically one-sided, which is kind of unfortunate because there is actually differences in the average amount of conspiracy belief between political parties. So it will kind of, to some degree, favor the liberal side, I think.
Yeah, and it's been interesting in my world to see this field of critical thinking eventually it's got a lot going against it, believe it or not. People hear critical thinking and they assume you're just going to attack them. It's has a very negative connotation. Argument, you want an argument, why should we be arguing? Can't we just all get along, right? So there's even fallacy has a bit of a sexual connotation to it. So there's all kinds of different aspects that I'm constantly swimming upstream against. We're actually thinking of rebranding it as clear thinking, or just trying to take the connotations away from it so that people will be maybe a little more open to accepting.
Yeah, it's going to be tricky. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier, is that what you are doing is you want people to analyze certain claims that people are making, and the people who are making those claims are going to push back no matter what you call this set of thinking. They're going to accuse you of trying to brainwash and indoctrinate children. So yeah, you definitely want to try to make it as neutral as possible. Even things like fact checking. If you talk about fact checking online, some people will tell you that fact checking is a conspiracy. That it's they don't believe fact checkers because fact checking itself is just something that was set up by George Soros to kind of discredit the conservatives. So it's everything gets tainted with a brush when you're in some kind of intellectual dispute.
Oh, for sure. That's a very well insulated view, isn't it? I mean, how do you crack through that level of defense mechanism?
Yeah, you kind of, I guess you can't really. You just kind of have to work your way around it.
Well, you were good in your books, being as open as you were, saying, this is who I am, this is what I've done, I've made a pile of money, I don't need to work anymore, I've turned all my attention towards this is how much it cost me to do this kind of stuff. So you put everything kind of on the table to let people know, I don't have an ulterior motive here, I'm not a shill, I'm not trying to mess with you. In the same way with critical thinking, we're trying to teach people how to think, not what to think. And that's the most important message that we try to get across, is that it's a skill set to help you look at information, because in your world, with dealing with people on Metabunk, you're constantly dealing with individuals who believe they are critical thinkers at a fairly high level, right? Like they look upon themselves as people who possess skills that maybe others don't. In my research, I've found that there seems to be a level of, you talked about uniqueness in the book, that do these people view themselves as unique? I see it as kind of a twofold aspect. There is status in being knowledgeable and having information that other people don't have. So there's an evolutionary aspect behind that, but it's also getting them high, because the feeling of being right is an incredible, we've watched MRI studies. We know that people who reconfirm their already held biases, and we see the serotonin, we see the vasopressin, we get it. We know that it's intoxicating to be right, and then to be perceived as right and have that extra status. How are we going to compete with that? How are we going to get people to go from their limbic system to the prefrontal cortex? How do we, override what Amy Farrah Fowler called the thriller adjacent to the amygdala?
Yeah. Well, you've got to get them to be right about the right things, and the best way of debunking something isn't just to point out that something is wrong; it's to show them what the correct answer is, so they discover for themselves. Then they get this same realization: oh yeah, this is real. I talked to a lot of people who used to be conspiracy theorists as well. It takes a long time for people to get out sometimes, and then they often kind of look back and reflect upon their old lives. And they see things as being so much better now that that things have been cleared up for them, and they understand really how the world works. So you want to replace this kind of red pill euphoria that they have of discovering this new world of interesting conspiracy theories with a blue pill euphoria of the actual real world that actually explains those from the real true context. See, when people get into the conspiracy theories, they have usually quite a limited understanding of the world, and they think they are gaining a vast amount of new understanding. But it's kind of like they've stepped up in their own way, but into a very distorted position, when the reality is even in a way higher than that. And then they'll eventually ascend to the real reality, hopefully, and this is what does happen, and they'll be able to see everything in perspective, their original naivety and their strange beliefs that were temporary.
So this is Plato's cave, essentially. They're seeing shadows on the wall.
That's funny.
They think the shadows are real.
Yeah, I was just talking about Plato's cave on Twitter today. It's a very popular allegory. Yeah, Plato's cave. I mean, it's you emerge from your previous beliefs into a new set of beliefs. I guess the challenge is, have you gone from the cave where you're just seeing shadows on the wall cast by a fire behind you and you're chained up? Have you moved from one cave to another cave? And this is kind of what happens. The allegory, I guess, of the rabbit hole is that you are descending into something, and you are descending into a new world. If you can think of people as starting out in a cave, most people aren't that intellectually crippled, but we're all living in some kind of a version of reality which is formed by our own perceptions and our own beliefs and our own minds. And as you get older and you learn more, you're emerging from caves. But I don't think it's just like a ladder that you climb up. It can be very circuitous, that you kind of move around to different chambers before you get out of it.
And we're going to come back to this process of discovery of how we can have the conversation, the dialogue, to get people out of the rabbit hole, to get them out of the cave. But let's go back just for a second. The conspiracy spectrums. You discuss this extremes from, say, suspecting big pharma as a one, big pharma selling drugs that people don't actually need, to a 10, which is like we have reptile overlords that are, masked up and that sort of thing. And then you mention the very important demarcation line, where on one side lies sensible theories and on the other lie kind of silly theories of disinformation. Tell us a bit about the importance of understanding where that line lies with your conspiracist friend. How do you know where their line is? What process do you use?
Well, the idea of the demarcation line came from the demarcation problem in science, which is, how do you know what is science and what is essentially pseudoscience or superstition and things like that? What is if we're studying, we can study like the tensile properties of steel, and that's science, and we can study like ESP and precognition or something like that, and is that science? It's debatable. And with conspiracy theories, each individual has a point at which they consider essentially everything on one side of it to be science, to be reasonable beliefs, beliefs that are backed up by evidence and that they think are either true or very plausibly true. And then on the other side of that, they have things that they think are nonsense, things that they think couldn't possibly be true or are not backed up by the evidence, or some kind of disinformation from the government that you shouldn't even look at. And so they draw a line somewhere, and people draw the lines in different positions. And if you're talking to someone who draws the line very low down, it's very different to talking to someone who draws the line further along, because there's no point talking to person A about things around person B's demarcation line. So you have to try to discover where they draw the line. And to do that, you need to figure out what they believe and then what they don't believe. And if you're familiar with the broad spectrum of the conspiracy theory, you can just simply ask them, the type of things that they believe. What do you think happened on 9/11, for example? Or what do you think these things in the sky are? And, what do you think is going on with vaccines or something like that? And then you just work in one direction or the other and try to find, what is the kind of the point on the spectrum where they believe something, but not the thing that's adjacent to it. They could believe that the World Trade Center was hit by planes, but the Pentagon wasn't. Or they could believe that the World Trade Center wasn't hit by planes, but they don't believe it was laser beams from space. So you got to figure out what they believe, what they don't, and then you can focus on the things on either side of the line.
Yes,
you can look at the things that they do believe, ask them why they believe it. Look at the things that they don't believe and ask them why they don't believe it, and then contrast the two. Is one really that different to the other? And that's a great conversation.
And I guess that gives people the capacity to have a kind of an almost visual representation of the work ahead of them in terms of bringing that line, moving that line, right? Bringing in more science.
It's more something. It's more something for your benefit than their benefit. I think. Right. Introducing this notion of a demarcation line to someone in conversation probably isn't going to be very helpful initially. In hindsight, it's going to be a good way of looking at where they were. But from your perspective, you've got to hone in on that region of their beliefs so that you can actually have a productive conversation.
For sure. Yeah, no, it's a very good point. When you mention that we should be open and honest with our conspiracy theory friends and only use verifiable facts, I'm wondering, does this not kind of beg the question by drawing quite heavily on what people have referred to as the information deficit model, that they just need more information, and of course they'll be able to crawl their way out of the rabbit hole? Does it presuppose or beg the question that just giving them more information will work?
If you put it like that, then yes. I think the information deficit model, is basically suggesting that people hold beliefs because they don't have enough information. But in my book, you don't start off by giving them information. It's a 3-step process, and the first step is establishing effective communication. The second step is supplying useful information. So the first step is really the most important one. You've got to establish effective communication. You've got to understand where they are coming from and try to communicate where you are coming from, which isn't supplying information. It's supplying them with context about who you are and what your motivations are and what you think. You're not fact checking at this point. Yeah. And then you got to establish some kind of common ground. There are going to be things, regardless of how divergent your beliefs about the world are, that you agree upon. Now, you can agree that some politicians are probably corrupt,
right?
That some people in business take bribes, things like that. You can agree upon things like that, and perhaps you can agree on other things as well, and then you can work from there. And you also need to understand the specifics of their belief. If someone says that I think the World Trade Center was an inside job, it doesn't tell you anything about what the details are of what they actually believe and what information you need to give them. So there's this process of discovery first, and this process of establishing a framework for effective communication, and then you can start to fill in the deficits in their information. And it's not just deficits. It's they have holes in their knowledge system that have been filled by something else. So you need to kind of get the other stuff out before you can get the good information in. So it's a complex and quite long process sometimes.
That's interesting. You said there's holes in their epistemic system. I've got behind me here my 1998 PhD dissertation, Evolutionary Epistemology and the Concept of Ignorance. I literally talk about lacunae, or gaps in our explanations, and we try to fill them up, right? We try to make sense of the world. But what if we're having the conversation, I'm a 9/11 truther, and you try to give me some information, and I say, well, I'm going to pull the shill card. You're just one of them. You're brainwashed. You're sheep. Look up, sheeple.
Yeah.
How do you move forward?
Well, there's two approaches to that. One is simply to say, if I was a shill, how would that change what I just told you? That depends very much on what we're actually talking about.
Right.
Is what I just told them something that's a verifiable fact? Here is like a USGS analysis of the dust of the 9/11 thing that shows that there wasn't very much iron in it, or something like that. Some little technical point. If I was a shill, would it change the contents of this document? Would it change the meaning? And then the other one is to try to essentially persuade them that you're not a shill, which I'm not. So you think it would be easy, but and in some ways it is. Yeah, the best communications I have with people are ones where they get to know me better. They get to know like who I am, what my background is, what my actual beliefs are. I was just on a podcast a couple of weeks ago, about a week ago, called The Theory of Everything, and I was on with this other guy called Eric Weinstein, who's kind of he has somewhat divergent beliefs than me on the issue of UFOs, and we were discussing this topic. And a lot of people went into watching that podcast and they thought, oh, Eric's going to destroy Mick when he's going to show him what a shill he is and what an idiot he is. And they came away from it because I had this reasonable conversation with this guy, basically with a newfound understanding of who I was and what my position was. And once you've kind of got to that position, you can actually kind of get past the shill accusation. Because these accusations of being a shill, they come essentially from ignorance. You wouldn't want to say that, use that word ignorance, but they come from not knowing me. They don't know who I am. And they don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing.
They also can't trust you as well, right? Because there is a level of paranoia sometimes built into.
I'm a stranger.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, there's just this natural kind of evolutionary distrust of strangers, people from outside of your tribe. And there's this kind of manifests itself sometimes as a distrust of people who disagree with you and who disagree with your worldviews, right. Because the conspiracy theories have evolved, the effective ones have evolved to have a property of othering anybody who doesn't believe.
Right. So in group, out group stuff.
Yeah, it makes it so you don't believe. It's a thing that happens in cults. They teach you in a cult that if someone is telling you that your leader is wrong, then they are lying, and that you should not listen to them. So they say, don't listen to the newspapers. And if someone is talking to you on the street and they start telling you that Sun Myung Moon is a cult leader, then you should start meditating and chanting inside your head so you can't listen to what they're saying. So it's this property of this type of belief, an effective property, that they want to shut out people. Mm-hmm. So you've got to be careful about how you actually get in there.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you originally got into debunking conspiracy theories by focusing on, is it Morgellons? How How do you
I
pronounce
pronounce it Morgellons, but it's also pronounced Morgellons.
Morgellons? Tell us what that belief involves and how you got into it.
Well, it's an interesting thing. It's essentially people believe there is a disease called Morgellons disease, which is characterized by small fibers emerging from your skin. And what it is people who have some kind of idiopathic symptoms, some kind of symptoms that don't have a definitive diagnosis, they are seeking out a cause. They're trying
Sure.
to figure out why they are sick. And a lot of people hit upon this thing called Morgellons disease, which says that it's caused by these little kind of infestation, essentially, of these little fiber-like things that emerge from your skin. And that they hear this, and then they they get a microscope and they start looking at their skin. They use, like, I think I have one. I don't have it with me, but they're a little handheld microscope. They look at their skin. They see little fibers, which are on everybody's skin, and they think that's what the reason is.
Can you use something like a magnifying glass?
Yeah, you could use like a little it's like one of those little. I've got a big microscope. Some of them use like the full size ones like this, and they analyze bits of their skin.
Okay, now answer me this: are the Morgellons organic? Are they alive?
The thing is, there isn't really such a thing as the Morgellons.
No, I know, but in their I know that in their minds.
Yeah.
No, in their minds, are they organic? Are they a species? Are they a biological organism?
It varies. It varies.
Oh, really? There's
some of people
levels.
think, yeah. Some people think there is some kind of nematode or something like that is just burrowing into their skin. Some people think it's a nanobot, some kind of microscopic robot that has been sprayed from the air and is infesting people's bodies to act as antennas for 5G radiation to control their thoughts, which sounds ridiculous, but some people actually believe that. So again, there's a range of beliefs.
I remembered hearing something and I looked it up, and sure enough, I think the most famous person who subscribes to Morgellons lives not too far from you. That's Joanie Mitchell. She believes she suffers from this particular disease. I mean,
I'm not sure if she's talked about it recently, but yes, it's people get sucked into essentially pseudoscientific medicine. We know people who believe in things that are not backed by science. The simplest example is homeopathy, which you go to a homeopathic doctor, it kind of feels like it's working because they talk to you and they give you some drops of something, and then you feel better later. But the actual efficacy of the medicine is not backed up by science. It's homeopathic things are
right. It's just
diluted.
Placebo at best.
Yeah. The most famous homeopathic thing is oscillococcinum, which is 10 to the power of 200 dilution, which, if you know anything about math, means it's less than one atom in the universe of the original stuff.
Isn't it? Somebody said if you're in London drinking a glass of water, you'd have a better chance of drinking in some of Oliver Cromwell's urine than you would of anything.
Yeah, if you were in Alpha Centauri or the Andromeda Galaxy, you would have a better chance of it, because that's just how rare it is. It doesn't work, but people believe it because it gives them solace that they have something that they can use to treat their symptoms. And people go to like faith healers and Reiki and crystals and things like that, and they think that they think that it's helping. And they go to people who pretend to diagnose their ills by like looking at their chakras and things like that, and they say you've got an energy blockage here, and I'll help you with it. So people believe it. People like Joanie Mitchell, she probably doesn't have a great scientific background, and she probably has friends who are into this type of like pseudo medicine, and they've recommended a doctor, and the doctor says, I can see that you have Morgellons. And it's very easy to fall into that type of thing.
Now, you started Metabunk in late 2010. You were doing the Morgellon site 3 years prior to that. You have been figuratively in the trenches, so to speak, talking to conspiracy theorists, right? Like you've been doing this for a long time. What patterns have you noticed? What's some of the most important? So for the average person out there who has a family member, what what can you say to them? How do you start the conversation? How do you keep it going? What happens when you lose them?
Yeah, the biggest commonality I found is that they're very touchy, very sensitive people, which is for a number of reasons, I think. And the biggest one is that they know that their belief is not a mainstream belief, and they know that a lot of people think that it's ridiculous, and they're afraid of mockery. They're afraid that people will make fun of them, so they don't like talking about it, and they get angry and naturally defensive. But they're also afraid of being proven wrong. They're holding on to a belief that they think is a defining belief in their worldview. With conspiracy theorists, they've discovered this wonderland, this whole new way of interpreting the universe. And if they were to accept that they've been wrong, that would be pretty paradigm shifting, and it's a big cognitive dissonance to even contemplate the fact that they might be wrong. So you have to be very careful when you're talking to people and try to understand the impact of what you are saying on this person, and to be selfless when you're doing it. I think a lot of people, when they talk to someone who is a conspiracy theorist, like a friend or someone, their natural inclination is to talk about how it makes them feel. And you say, I think, this seems very ridiculous that you believe this, and I can't understand why it is, and it just sounds so stupid to me, and it's they view it from their own perspective, and you've really
Of
got to
course.
look at it from their perspective if your goal is to help them.
Right. Touching on the amount of experience you've had with conspiracy theorists, let's talk a bit about the psychology. I know you don't put a lot of stock into just labeling or pigeonholing somebody. Oh, you have X, therefore you're going to become a conspiracy theorist. Of course, we're not going to commit that kind of logical error. But some researchers have found that there seems to be correlations, at least, between conspiracy theorists and people having certain tendencies like schizotypy, narcissism, things like that. What are your thoughts on the psychology, the psychological makeup of somebody who would be more inclined to fall for questionable or dubious information?
Well, my feeling there is that there are correlations between various things, various psychological factors that make people somewhat predisposed to be conspiracy theories. And it can be useful to consider those. If you want to, like, the uniqueness thing is, it's the need for uniqueness. People feel like they want to be unique, and then when they do discover some conspiracy theory that they think the mainstream doesn't agree with, then they feel unique, and that can be a motivating factor. But it's not the whole thing. It's not the entirety of why they believe things. They're not simply people who need to be unique. Therefore, they discover this, and therefore, by observing this and helping that particular aspect, you're going to fix them. These are just small things. You look at the amount of the correlation in these studies. And for one thing, the studies are fairly simplistic. They're taking surveys, and then they do a little experiment, and then they see how much the result of the survey changes. It's not really something that you can take and apply to the real world. And the changes are often quite small, like 5 to 10% or something like that. They're not really huge, significant things. But it is useful. It is useful to look at these things, because I think these predispositions and these psychological factors are actually things that everybody has to some degree or another.
Sure.
I
Right.
have a need for uniqueness. I like feeling special. I mean, who doesn't? Like, you enjoy that feeling of having accomplished something
Right.
that other people haven't done. That's great. But it doesn't mean I'm going to be a conspiracy theorist because of it. But if
Right.
the broader set of circumstances of my life led me to being a conspiracy theorist, then that aspect of it is certainly something that's in play
Yeah,
and
yeah.
something that we can talk about.
You mentioned biases. Just to let you know, in my books, I do what's called the ABCs of critical thinking: argument, bias, context, and then D, E, and F is diagram, evidence, and fallacies. So it gives everybody the kind of the tools of the critical thinking skill set. You mentioned the Dunning-Kruger effect, basically selective memory, Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, seeing or hearing something frequently after you hear it or see it for the first time. How important is it to recognize our own biases and then try to communicate this to conspiracy theorists? How open should we be? Should we admit to them, look, I'm biased as well. I used to think X. Like, does that help in terms of bridging and getting that communication flowing better?
Yeah, I think you need to acknowledge that everybody has some kind of cognitive biases. We all have a limited understanding of the universe, and probably some of that understanding of the universe and just the way the world works is probably wrong and probably lacking in some ways. And we probably all have some kind of desire for the way things want to be, even if it's a subconscious thing. We can't all be, objective robots about reality. And so that's certainly something that you can admit to the person you're talking to your friend. So you don't want to be, obviously you want to avoid accusing them of being biased, but at the same time claiming you yourself are not biased. You can point out, as you say, that biases are something that everybody has, and it's quite an understandable thing that I'm biased, you're biased, and let's see if we can figure out what our biases are, and if perhaps get past them together.
I liked that was a very good part of the book that I very much, it resonated well with me. In terms of identifying biases and having that open dialogue with an individual, you had mentioned kind of like that 3-step technique: maintaining effective dialogue and supplying useful information, and then giving it time, right? It's not a quick fix, right? It's going to take some time. In the research that I've done, I basically have stated it kind of like the shampoo rinse repeat format, where I say listen, trust, suggest, repeat. And so that you listen to them. By listening to them and not judging and not challenging, you put them at ease. They feel more open. And the techniques that I'm putting into the dialogue are Socratic and use a bit of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really Socrates brought into the psychology realm, talk therapy. And so how I have discussions with people who are conspiratorial minded is to feign ignorance to a point, which is to say, no, I had no idea the towers came down by controlled explosions. I thought the planes was the cause. That's not the reason. Really? Why? What reasons do you have? So I'm genuinely interested in what they have to say, but the Socratic approach uses then logic so that you can say, oh, okay, wait a minute. 5 minutes ago you said A, and now you're saying not A. I was with you. You were saying A. Okay. Should I change my understanding to not A now? So you literally let the person try to work through the logic themselves. What happens when logic isn't a factor? I mean, there are some people who simultaneously believe royalty killed Princess Diana and she staged her own death, so that she's still alive and dead simultaneously. Yeah. What happens when logic is abandoned?
I actually have some doubts about that particular study that you referred to.
Is that right?
I think if you actually ask the person whether they actually do hold those two beliefs, they would tell you no. It's kind of an overlapping of two different questions.
Okay.
And more about likelihood of things than actual reality. But yeah, rationality isn't always a play. I mean, obviously it's not a play a lot of the time. And you can't just simply go into a situation like you're a plumber trying to fix a pinhole leak behind the wall and then start dismantling the wall, finding the leak, patching the leak, reassembling the wall, and just going through a series of steps that will take you to a solution. You don't know how these things are going to work. You can kind of lead the horse to water type thing, but you don't know how well it is going to work. So I think you ask, like, what can you do if rationality isn't there? You essentially do the same thing. And I think a lot of the time it comes down to essentially the weight of things. When you talk to people who are big conspiracy believers, you will not make progress. In fact, you will seem to be having backwards progress. Yeah, sometimes you'll find someone you can have a nice Socratic discussion with, and you will inch them towards the right thing. But often they will push back, regardless of what you say. And if you say something that seems to make sense to them, they will immediately be very suspicious and think that you're trying to trick them. They'll step away from what you're doing, and they might even start believing in their belief even more. People talk about the backfire effect, which is something that's kind of does happen, but it's not a hard and fast rule. But sometimes people will double down if you lead them towards something that disagrees with their beliefs. So it's something that you approach gently with kid gloves, and you don't want to expect some kind of results. Sometimes you're just laying the groundwork, you're planting seeds, and then you can come back later. You're talking about the rinse and repeat type thing. Well, it's this repetition of things can be useful as long as that repetition doesn't cause them to start fighting you.
Sure.
If they start fighting you, then it can actually make things worse.
Yeah.
So you've got to kind of, in a way, dance around. It's very unfortunate. You feel like you should be able to get in there and explain to them, or at least do something like with your carefully constructive Socratic dialogues that are very responsive to what's going on. You feel like you should be able to make progress, but then you don't, and it's very disheartening when you're in that type of conversation. But what I found is that even those discussions, as long as they don't start fighting you, it is laying a bit of a foundation. You're telling them some stuff. They might start thinking about it later. They start thinking about it later when they're not being pressured. Right now you're talking to them. They feel very defensive. They feel like they're being boxed in. But if you just suggest something and then go away and come back a week later, they may well have thought about it, and they may tell you something. I was at a flat Earth conference a few years ago, and I was talking to one of the speakers there who, like, in the conference in front of the audience, and I told him something about the way sunlight bends, and he had it backwards, and he basically flat out rejected it. But then at the end of the conference, about a day or two later, he came up to me and said, "I've been thinking about that, and I think you got a good point with that." So give it time. These things do work, but not always immediately.
Right. Now, in terms of spectrum, again, one of the things I've been looking into in determining how to find out where your friend is on the spectrum, should we be considering their degree to which they subscribe to a particular conspiracy theory, and also consider, are there elements of danger to themselves or to others? So the gentleman from North Carolina who went up to Ping Pong Orbit Pizza with an AR-15 because he believed in QAnon, that's pretty dangerous. At what point are we now responsible for the public safety of this person, or perhaps others? That's a tough one, I know, but
it is. But I think those types of events are fairly rare. The vast majority of people who believe in some kind of conspiracy theory are not going to go to Comet Ping Pong and shoot it up. They're not going to try to run a train into a ship. And those people who do those types of things are perhaps, they have some kind of mental issues in addition to their conspiracy beliefs. Now, sometimes we hear about, say, a mother who kills her children because she thinks that chemtrails were poisoning them, and they won't have a life. That's not really because of the chemtrail conspiracy theory. It's because she has a deep psychosis that was causing her to have these paranoid delusions about the world, and it would have been something else, and it could have happened in a different way and might have even happened sooner. So you can't really blame the conspiracy theories for the actions of all these people. But yeah, there certainly are times where it's more important. One of the ones I talked about in my book was a very simple thing, which was a relative of mine
Right.
was starting to get into this multi-level marketing
Right. I
thing.
remember.
And she was being suckered in by a couple of friends who had told her that she could start her own business, and all they should do was invest £5,000 and get this suitcase full of cosmetics. And I knew that if I didn't step in straight away and be fairly forceful in my explanations, then she might get sucked in. And so I did have to devote more time than I guess I would normally do and be a bit more forceful. You can leverage your relationships there. It was a close family member. And I was able to explain to her that, essentially it was a scam, and these people they were just basically trying to get their commission. And these cosmetics weren't any safer than normal cosmetics. So yeah, there are times when you need to be more forceful. And if you see imminent danger, you might want to take additional steps, like informing the police, for example.
Right. Now, you had mentioned some of Dan Dennett's advice for establishing common ground. Re-express their position better than they do it themselves. List points of agreement, especially on common points, and mention anything that you have learned from them. In critical thinking, this is known as steel manning, another's argument or another's position, as opposed to straw manning or misrepresenting it deliberately or unintentionally. In all of my books, I mention that fairness is the golden rule and the cornerstone of critical thinking. And I think that's extremely important in dealing with anybody, let alone conspiracy theorists or not. How ready, though, are people going to be in terms of being accessible to logic, to reason, to evidence, if this is precluded by a mental incapacity, say a mental health issue? And then what would the advice then be if it's just you've met an impasse and all the logic in the world isn't going to help this person? What would you suggest the next steps might be?
Yeah, you've got to know your audience, and skeptics like to talk about logical fallacies, and they will say, "Aha, you're using the Ed Proctor thing." I don't even know the Latin names for these things.
Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Yeah.
Yes, that one. That's you're begging the question, or whatever the fallacy is. And then they say, describe it to the person. But yeah, that's not going to work at all. No one cares about fallacies in conversations. It's a thing that skeptics do between themselves for fun. I think often the best thing you can do for people is try to supply them with more context that will be useful to them. You don't have to do things that directly address their particular beliefs. You can talk to them, which is just part of establishing effective communication. And you can talk to them about things that might be useful as background information, things that they might not understand. And one example I give is looking at the Forbes list of billionaires. These are the people who have the most money in the world, the most powerful people in the world, and you look at just how diverse all these people are. Very, very different, often with nothing at all to do with each other. And then you can the idea there is that you're trying to contrast that with their belief, the conspiracy theory belief, that there's a secret cabal running the world. So you're trying to establish something, this background information that here are the Waltons, and here's Elon Musk, and here's Carlos Fox, and here's the Chinese people, and here's people from France and Australia, and all these different people, nothing at all really to do with each other. How could that possibly work as some kind of global conspiracy? And the list is 1,000 people on it. So it's not like just they're all getting in a room somewhere and deciding how the world is going to work. So this is something that you can tell them about. You can talk about, say they're into chemtrails. You could talk about cloud seeding. Planes do actually fly and spray stuff on clouds sometimes. This is something you can just simply discuss, the simple science behind it. You don't have to say, this isn't chemtrails, this doesn't prove chemtrails. You just discuss it as an interesting topic in itself, because is going to give them background. You don't have to say, like, I'm going to give you some background now. You just talk about something that will give them background.
Sure. Well, let's do that. Let's you and I talk about some of the conspiracy theories that are out there. The 9/11 truthers, the people who believe that it was not, let's just stick with the Twin Towers, that it was not planes that actually did that. I am going to give you a fallacy because as a critical thinker, I do actually think they have use in society.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, we are skeptics discussing things amongst ourselves. So.
They're violating Occam's razor, right? They're violating the more simpler explanation, which is a plane goes in, it hits the building, there's fire, beams start melting, start warping, it can't sustain the weight anymore, it pancakes down, and that's why those buildings came down. So that's the simplest explanation.
Is it though? The problem is it's not the simplest in their minds, because the actual collapse of the building is very complicated. Yeah, so they think that there is a simpler explanation, which is that explosives were in the building. So yeah, the planes hit the building, and then there was a fire, then the buildings collapsed. And they collapsed in a very dramatic way. There's this big expulsion of material, and it came down from the top down, and it looked like things were exploding out of the sides. And people can't figure out how that actually happened. So for them, the simpler explanation is that it was explosives. So it's not really a violation of Occam's razor there. It's really that they don't understand why there is a simpler explanation. They're not picking a more complicated explanation. They're picking something that in their mind is the simpler explanation. And unfortunately, this is a problem I have a lot, is that a lot of the real world explanations are complicated. So you get this kind of God of the gaps issue, where in their mind there are gaps in the explanation because they can't understand it, or it's not been explained to them well enough, and they fill those gaps with this simple thing,
right,
of explosives.
And they've seen other buildings come down, right? And so they assume that's how that must have come down.
That's an interesting thing. They see other buildings come down, but the World Trade Center, Twin Towers, looks nothing like any other controlled demolition.
No.
Except for a subset of demolitions called Verinage, which is a French type of demolition where they don't use explosives. They have a version of, they use the way to the building. Yeah, they remove one floor by jacking it. I think Verinage actually means jacking. So they use hydraulic jacks to kind of push over the columns on one floor, and the top falls down and crushes the bottom part. So it's in that sense, the simple logical fallacy is that they are incorrect. They have the wrong explanation. They're missing something. I don't know how you put it otherwise. And the challenge there is to get the context across, where they can understand that there's things like Verinage demolition looks like what we saw there. Conventional demolition does not look like it, and that there is an explanation for how the buildings could have collapsed the way they did, which might take a little bit of effort for them to understand. So it's an interesting challenge.
Do you remember where you were on that morning?
Yes, I was in my car when I first heard the news. I was in my car on the 405.
Been there. Did you eventually watch it? Did you see it live, or did you see footage later?
No, by the time I'd got to work, both buildings had collapsed. When I woke up in the morning, I did not listen to any news or anything. And so the first I heard of it was when I just got from the 10 to the 405 going north towards the valley, and I just turned on the radio and I heard what I thought was some kind of radio drama where they're talking about bombs in the White House and evacuating and buildings exploding, and I thought, what is this? And switched the channel and it was on something else.
Wow. And were you surprised when you saw the buildings come down? Did you think for a second, wait a minute, that shouldn't have done that?
No, I was not. I don't remember any kind. I mean, I remember I heard it on the radio first. A lot of people had a different experience, a visual experience, and so I heard what had happened. Planes had hit them, and then the buildings had collapsed. So I'd already kind of accepted that that's what had happened. And then later, when I saw it, I just saw the collapse. But later on, obviously, I hear about these conspiracy theories, and I think they're understandable. It's understandable people would have questions about how could this have happened.
Sure.
And there's very simple
Sure.
things that people raise, like Newton's laws of motion, and they say, like, how could a small thing destroy a large thing? And there are answers to these questions, but unfortunately, they are
Of
a little
course.
bit complicated.
And science often is, right? I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes the explanation isn't simple, it's very complicated and very difficult.
Even things like the flat Earth has complicated things in it, and it becomes almost an insurmountable obstacle. People in the flat Earth community like firing lasers over lakes, and to them this proves that the Earth is flat because you can see a laser across the lake surface from 20 miles away, when the curve of the lake should actually have obscured that laser. But the reason you can see it is that the refraction of the atmosphere over the cool water of the lake will bend the light down, and you can see it on the other side of the lake. But that's a complicated thing to explain. So there's this issue of science, which is a big challenge in this type of discussion.
Mm-hmm. Now, the whole flat Earth phenomenon, it was fairly low key, and then hit a spike fairly recently. And even a well-known basketball player, Kyrie Irving, I'm not sure if you're familiar,
Mm-hmm.
he was a huge advocate, and then apparently came out of the rabbit hole and said, no, I got sucked in. And apparently the people who got through to him were elementary school teachers saying, how are we going to teach these kids with a globe when they want to look at a Frisbee?
Yeah.
Right. So he did a little more research, and I guess he got himself out. Should we be using people like Kyrie Irving as spokespeople to basically say, it happened to me, it can happen to anybody? Like, would he be a good PSA person?
Yeah, I think so, because anybody who's held a belief and then has figured out that the belief is wrong uh, has a very good perspective, because they understand how easy it was for them to get sucked in. They understand the seductiveness of those ideas, and then they also understand just how wrong they are, and how hypocritical the people within the community are. Google and YouTube did a thing a few years ago, probably still going, called the Redirection Project. It's part of their Jigsaw subdivision, which is encountering disinformation, and it was aimed at young jihadists, and people would search for jihadist themed videos on YouTube back when they had that type of content. And what they would do is they would, show them whatever the search results were, but then put in the, playing next thing in the sidebar, a video by someone who was a former jihadist. And then this former jihadist would simply talk about what his experience was being a jihadist, and how it was not what they expected, and how the other people weren't very holy people, and how they eventually came to realize that what they were doing was wrong, and how they talked to their imams about it, things like that.
Right.
Stuff that was valuable perspective. And so I think that talking to former believers, actually having former believers to talk to someone, is a very valuable tool.
Yeah, you'd mentioned that in the book, a number of people you've helped out of the rabbit hole are now doing it themselves. Are there any plans in the works for a network, any way in which we could draw upon their expertise now to help others?
It's usually a fairly small number, unfortunately. Most people who come out of the rabbit hole kind of just essentially fade back into normal life, or part way into normal life. They still maintain some conspiratorial beliefs, but not as much as before. The kind of evangelical former believer is much more the exception than the rule. And I can't really gather a group of them together, but I think it certainly is useful. And in some of the bigger theories that have affected more people, there are groups are former believers. With QAnon, there's Reddit groups for both people who used to be believers in the QAnon conspiracy theory, and also support groups for relatives like QAnon Anonymous, which is people who they've had relatives who were believers or are believers.
Right.
So yeah, like these types of communities, I think, are things that we should encourage, things that can be useful resources.
And why, like, of all the conspiracy theories that I've studied, QAnon on paper shouldn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just so detached from reality. Like with JFK's assassination, with the moon landing, any of that stuff, I guess it's feasible, that there's more people involved, that the whole moon landing thing was fake. Yeah, that's feasible on, Hollywood levels, right? But QAnon is detached from reality and is somewhat metaphysical. It's involving like Satan, right? Like people worshiping, and it's satanic, it's otherworldly. And is this one of the first times in history we've had, I mean, outside of the Jewish cabals back in the medieval times, what's going on here? Why are people, how can people believe that?
Well, it's kind of two things in a way. I mean, you touched on one of them outside of the Jewish cabals type thing, but that is a thread that has been running through conspiracy theories since the dawn of I don't know of civilization. That this group of others, which is conveniently the Jewish people, has been the scapegoats for conspiracy beliefs. Back in the time of the Black Death, people were looking for people to blame for this plague, and they picked the Jews, and then they gathered up Jewish people, put them in houses, and burnt the house down, thinking that would help. But yeah, this is just the latest manifestation of basically anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But QAnon also is a product of where we are as a society and a technological society. It's kind of a product of a rapid feedback loop that we have with social media that has allowed conspiracy theories to evolve more rapidly because they get more rapid feedback. And it's become a kind of uber conspiracy, a conspiracy theory that encompasses all the other conspiracy theories and seeks to essentially explain the whole world. And it gives it this background framework of satanic cabal, but in some ways that's not almost that important. It's more that there is this shadowy otherness, but it has a quality of being what's been described as self-sealing. Like if someone points out that there's something wrong with it, they say, "Oh, look, Q said that Hillary Clinton was going to be arrested in 2019, and then she wasn't," then that doesn't invalidate the conspiracy theory because they just simply explain why that happened. They say, "Oh, well, yeah, that had to happen that way because of where we are now." So if you look at where we are now, it's explained by everything in the past. It's the simplest way of describing what they do, but they throw in a bunch more convolutions, of course. But it's a theory that has evolved properties that make it ideal for being propagated and being maintained. You can think of any conspiracy theory as being a kind of a meme, like a mental virus, and it has to have certain phenotype expressions. Not in a virus, but there's certain things that it does that are beneficial to its propagation. And if there are lots of conspiracy theories that you don't hear about because they were terrible, they weren't very good conspiracy theories, and they died out. Someone like some of the school shooting things that no one really believed them very much. They existed for a while, but they didn't really last. But then others are much more long-lived, like the JFK conspiracy theories and various stripes. 9/11's conspiracy theory is kind of dying out. But QAnon is a very dynamic one. It's constantly evolving, and that makes it very difficult to address. And you can have a very hard time talking to people who are believers in QAnon.
Yeah. I've been looking at, I'm wondering to what extent the people who devised it, do we know? Like at some point they thought it was a father and a son that were doing this. I don't know if we've gotten any closer. on knowing the origin?
Yeah, it's still not entirely clear who it is. Yeah, but there's
Right.
the father and the son. The names escape me for the second. But and then there's other people like General Flynn, Michael Flynn, who are involved in it, and we don't know to what degree. People like Steve Bannon, who have used it essentially and benefited from it because
Oh, it's very convenient.
yeah,
Sure.
it's very helpful for them. And we don't know to what degree they might have encouraged it or even be responsible for some aspects of it.
You have to admit there are certain elements of it that are brilliant. What do Americans hate? Satan and
Yeah,
pedophilia,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
it touches on nerves that any normal person couldn't, like it just gets to people. And then to phrase it in a way that is kind of a Nostradamus ambiguity, you put these breadcrumbs out there that could mean 50 different things. It plays on semantic ambiguity really well, so that whether they're right or they're wrong in terms of these things realizing, they can always use the ad hoc, right? Well, oh, well, the reason why is just wait till next week, right? It's always something in the future with QAnoners. It's never, aha, see, we said it was going to happen and it did. It's always, okay, it didn't happen, but something even more spectacular is going to happen. You just wait. So there's a sense of hucksterism to it as well, right?
yeah. It's kind of a tried and tested approach. Yeah,
Yes.
Nostradamus is still famous to this day because his approach worked. His quatrains of very random stuff that you could fit to anything, they worked. And the whole blood libel thing, where people accused Jews of stealing children and drinking their blood, is essentially the same thing as the belief of QAnon now. And it worked back in the Middle Ages because it touches those nerves, those things that
Yes.
people dislike. We're
That's
very
right.
protective of children. We don't like the devil if we're religious.
Correct.
So these are things that we know are touch points pressure points that you can apply pressure to, and something will happen. So yeah, they're basically doing things that have worked through all of human history, and putting on this new spin of the internet being the propagation method, and then sticking it in the framework of
Mm-hmm.
Trump being some kind of savior character.
Yeah. That's interesting. And in the book I'm working on now, I've talked about a a diametric relationship over the past 20 years, demonstrating that essentially what I call the demise of newsprint journalism and the rise of social media, that this kind of helped to generate a perfect storm. And then you throw a pandemic at people and they're stuck in front of their computers. Naturally, right, we're going to see the algorithms at work, confirming biases and whatnot. You talk a bit about this in your book. Do you think this is going to get better? Do you think Zuckerberg, do you think anybody is going to do something? Are they doing something? Are they doing enough?
I think they're definitely doing something, and they've been doing things for the last basically since before my book was written. They've been working on this, and you search for these things online now, and they don't come up. If you search for flat Earth, you're going to get lots of on YouTube. You're going to get lots of educational videos about why the Earth isn't flat, whereas before you would get kind of the opposite. And if you start watching flat Earth videos, then you're going to get these educational videos there, and you get little things underneath the videos saying things. People on same thing on Twitter.
Is that written into the algorithm itself?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's explicitly, yeah, it is. They explicitly are flagging certain types of content as disinformation, and they are downplaying that in the algorithms, and they're upplaying other things. With things like flat Earth, it's kind of cut and dried. Um, it gets more problematic when we start talking about things that are very politically polarized. Things like elements of election fraud, things like that. If you, but there again, they certainly are still downplaying these things. And if you put vaccine misinformation online, it will get removed. But what's happening is that they're doing things, but it's not necessarily simply curing it. It's creating a different situation. A lot of people are moving away from the traditional platforms like. I say traditional. It's not that long of a tradition, but like YouTube and Twitter, and Facebook, and they're moving to other like kind of walled gardens, like Trump's Truth Social alternative to Twitter and Facebook. People are gathering there, and they're talking, and they're basically being indoctrinated in other places. So whilst it has stopped the flow of information, disinformation on a large scale, it's created these other kind of areas, these arenas where people can have discussions without being exposed to the more reality based information. And so it's creating a new set of problems. And then there's all kinds of problems coming down the line with artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that's my next question, actually. And maybe we can leave off with this, the kind of the future of conspiracy theories. With technology like GPT-3, and you're a computer guy, you'll know what I'm talking about. I know very little about this. And DALL-E 2 technology, where I can ask a program to write me a car advertisement in the voice of Shakespeare, and it'll do it in 3 seconds. Or I can ask DALL-E 2 to create me an image of Winston Churchill riding a tricycle on the moon, and it'll give me 1,000 different versions of that. And video is not far behind. What's our defense in the future of knowing what is real and what isn't real? And then how quickly is that going to generate disinformation online? And what will our best defense be?
I think our best defense is educating people that this happens. People understand now that we have Photoshop, and that a photograph of somebody doing something doesn't mean they actually did that thing. They don't necessarily understand that a video of somebody saying something means that didn't happen, or that they don't understand if they're talking to somebody online that might be a bot. People are starting to understand it, but it's not something I think that is really being taught in any kind of formal way. And if you're doing some kind of course in critical thinking, and this should be a foundational thing that people are taught in schools now, is to understand that artificial intelligence could be behind whatever you're looking at. It's not that long in the future before people will be able to have a conversation with someone who sounds and looks just like me and gives arguments that are just as eloquent as what I'm giving now, if not better. Recently there was in the news, there was an engineer at Google, I believe, who believed that the AI he was talking to was sentient, that it was actually self-aware, and that it was a real person, essentially. And if you read the transcripts of the conversation that he had with it seems like that is true, because this artificial intelligence is very good at pretending to be a person. And it's basically every single time he asks it a question, it's not replying from its own brain. It's computing what would a person say in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of interactions that people have now online are text-based conversations, where they talk in comments, or they're talking in tweets, in Twitter, and they're on Facebook. And you can have artificial intelligence that exists right now that has incredibly sophisticated and compelling conversations with you. And if you unleash that at scale, you could persuade an entire generation of people. You can move them in one direction ideologically, or in some kind of disinformation direction. And that's a very serious issue for the near future.
Pre-internet here in Canada, there were a series of commercials, one of the most famous being what's called House Hippo. I showed it to you before we began taping, which looks like a documentary about tiny little hippopotamuses living in your closet and whatnot. And people, when they first saw this, it was kind of like a War of the Worlds moment, until they, at the very end they say, but of course, this can't be real. So we had PSAs in the 90s telling parents to help educate their kids and whatnot. What will we do with GPT-3 and DALL-E 2 and whatever else is going to come after that, where those lines of knowing what is real and what isn't are blurred to the point where we're not actually sure who are the go-to people? Will it still be Snopes and PolitiFact, and will it be these other groups that we can depend on to look into this and find out for us?
Yeah, that's a challenge because people don't trust Snopes, they don't trust PolitiFact, and they don't trust even factcheck.org. They think that these are organizations that are funded by people who are opposed to whatever they are debunking. So it's a problem. With the House Hippo thing, that was using something that I think pretty much everybody who watched it, no one actually thinks that there were tiny hippos in the house. What they've got to do is do that with things that are actually believable. Show how an AI could actually seem like a real person, a very simple, mundane thing, a real person who could be trying to trick you online, and educate people about those types of things. But I think also we need to have some kind of technology, and perhaps even legislation that prevents this type of thing. Should we allow artificial intelligent agents to basically influence people at scale without any sort of oversight whatsoever? Should we let Russia set up a whole millions of AI bots to swarm over Facebook and Twitter and persuade people that Russia is right in the Ukraine matter? This is something that needs to be addressed, and I really don't think people in government are really doing anything at all about it at the moment.
So are we going to see another sad case of politicians reacting rather than being proactive?
Well, the politicians haven't been doing very much at all of late, so if they can do something, that would be good. But yeah, I think it's probably going to come more from the technology providers like Facebook and YouTube and Google. But I think eventually it's going to need some kind of action from the government, because it's going to be a very difficult situation.
Right. Agreed. Well, listen, Mick, I want to thank you for joining us today. It was a real pleasure having you on the show. Are you working on anything currently? Is there something we need to keep apprised of?
I've been a bit distracted by UFOs for the last few months. I am working on a book on UFOs, and I think like we talked about earlier, there are no entirely harmless conspiracy theories, and there's lots of interesting aspects of the UFO belief. And one of the most destructive conspiracy theory actions was the Heaven's Gate mass suicide, which came from a belief in UFOs. That's right. So it's a very, very interesting subtopic that I hope to get a book out on eventually.
Oh, good. I'm looking forward to that. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
All right, you take care.
You too. Thank you very much.